Last episode, we dived into many tariff events of the past. Today, we're going to dive into the effects that these tariff events of the past had on certain aspects of the economy in which they were imposed, such as inflation, the trade deficit, manufacturing, and the jobs market. Now, depending on the historical tariff being focused on, the effects on these characteristics are different every time, but in exploring how these characteristics are affected by previous tariff events, this can then help us frame these questions when we consider the Trump tariffs today. So I will start with inflation. Now, when it comes to tariffs, inflation isn't always guaranteed. It often depends on the overall economic environment and the areas that have been targeted by tariffs. For example, McKinley's tariff from the 1890s was the earliest of the examples that we covered in last episode, in which we saw a rise in consumer prices. Reagan's tariffs and Trump's tariffs from his first term also led to price rises in specific sectors, especially steel. But sweeping inflation is very rarely seen as a consequence of tariffs. Moving on to the trade deficit, and of every tariff example that we've discussed, none have worked particularly well in addressing the US trade deficit. Often, when tariffs are implemented, we see other nations retaliate, or tariffs affect other sectors and hurt exports. Of all our examples, only Nixon's tariffs had a short-term improvement to the trade deficit, but as we know today, the trade deficit still exists, and so it hasn't properly been addressed by any historical tariff occurrences. Moving on to manufacturing, and one of Trump's aims is to reindustrialise and reignite American industry. Tariffs can often help to do this, and this is where, out of the characteristics we'll discuss today, Trump could see the most success. The tariff of abominations ensured that the North was protected, and the Morrill tariff led to a wartime boom for Northern manufacturing. Both McKinley and Nixon's tariffs also led to short-term booms. However, on the flip side, the Smoot-Hawley tariff hurt manufacturing, but this was during the Great Depression, where we saw little economic activity anyway. When nations retaliated during the Great Depression, this also worsened the economic downturn for the US. This means, again, the overall macro environment is an important consideration when policymakers are considering whether to implement tariffs or not. Finally, with a potential increasing to manufacturing, jobs in these sectors could also increase. Specific sectors would see boosts, as we saw in the northern industries from the tariff of abominations and the Morrill tariff, and also urban jobs from McKinley's tariffs. Nixon's tariffs also had a stimulus effect, and Reagan's tariffs boosted jobs in some sectors. However, Smoot-Hawley led to massive job losses in agriculture, as did Trump's first-term tariffs. So again, the direction and the macroeconomic environment in which tariffs are implemented are a very important consideration. In exploring this history, we need to keep in mind that we could see many of these trends and patterns re-emerge today. We will ultimately see what happens in July when the deadline for Trump's current tariff pause is reached. So now let's zoom in and explore the potential effects that Trump's tariffs could have on inflation, the trade deficit, manufacturing, and the jobs market, if they do return. Firstly, covering inflation, the Federal Reserve certainly believes that inflation could be an issue. even if Trump's Liberation Day tariffs aren't returned, but just from his blanket tariffs that he has introduced since he came back into office. This is seen by the fact that the Fed is trying to push potential rate cuts further into the future, much to the anger of Trump. But as we've seen throughout history, in tariff occurrences, inflationary pressures aren't guaranteed. However, declining economic activity will likely occur in some stifled sectors, and inelastic supply could lead to price spikes. Moving on to the trade deficit, and the biggest factor here will be the dollar. During the oil and shale boom, the United States increased production, and hence reliance on imports of oil and gas fell. Eventually, oil and gas imports balanced out with the value of exports. During the same period, the value of the US dollar rose by 20%. This made US exports more expensive and imports more attractive. As a result of more attractive imports, the trade deficit actually increased when we considered imports made in other sectors. Now, the trade deficit is a part of the overall current account deficit, and to reduce the overall current account deficit, the US would have to find a way to reduce the inflow of foreign capital. This could involve a depreciation of the value of the US dollar, which is what we are seeing Trump pursue successfully currently. His pursuit of a cheaper dollar could be to counter this fact that if the value of the dollar rises, then imports become more attractive, which isn't what Trump wants. However, bear in mind, as we've seen from all the historical examples that we've discussed, often tariff policies don't make long-term dents in US deficits, and so Trump has a job on his hands here. Moving on to manufacturing, and there is a nuance to discuss here. Are manufacturing jobs declining because labour is being exported to nations where it's cheaper, or is automation taking jobs in manufacturing that were previously held by people? Automation plays a huge role here, as also does the rise of the US's services sector. Of the four characteristics discussed, those being inflation, the trade deficit, manufacturing and jobs, it's here in manufacturing where Trump could see the most success. We've seen many companies such as Nvidia, Apple and TSMC pledging funding and ensuring that they will focus on expanding operations within the United States. But I believe whether this effort from these companies stays will depend on if the tariffs stay. If they don't, I don't see how companies would commit to years of staff training or the construction of new facilities if they didn't need to do this. So for US manufacturing to be given a boost in the long term, Trump will either have to hope that his blanket tariffs are enough that he's already imposed, or businesses and other nations from around the world will have to believe that Trump plans on implementing more tariffs. Otherwise, if this doesn't occur, he risks hurting both manufacturing and services. Finally, when it comes to the jobs market, again, this is a double-edged sword. In industries that tariffs are seeking to protect due to import competition, job losses can be avoided. However, in sectors that are reliant on imports, job cuts could occur as businesses scale back in an effort to protect their profitability. Retaliation can also reduce demand for US exports, further damaging US labour in some sectors. The negative impact on jobs will especially be felt by small businesses, but as we saw when we discussed the tariff equation, with little thought going into the mathematics behind that equation, this likely hasn't been considered. To end, I have 2 points I want to make. My first point is whether the US tariffs would lead exporters to the United States to lower their prices in an effort to ensure that export amounts remain the same. or if we will see foreign businesses actually shoulder the costs of tariffs by eating into their profits. Even in the world today, where globalization is fading, even if you don't believe it's fading, you can't argue with the fact that it's definitely shifting. If the United States doesn't want a specific product that it used to import from any nation in the world, I'm sure that there are other nations around the world who will take these products. This is being seen in my belief that we are seeing trade between the EU and China grow. This is in large part due to the psychological effects of Trump's trade policy and distrust that is growing in the United States. It's ideas such as this that make me believe that companies around the world won't massively shift their current trading practices and won't eat into their own profits in an effort to remain in US markets. Finally, I want to discuss a concept that I have introduced before when speaking about China. This is the concept of economic complexity. Now, the United States possesses a relatively high economic complexity, and this means that it can produce a wide range of goods, especially in advanced industries. This means that the US has greater adaptability of supply chains when tariffs raise the cost of imports from abroad. However, in supply chains that are interdependent, such as semiconductors, tariffs can disrupt these supply chains and increase input costs. This ultimately undermines the very industries that give the United States its complexity, and it makes them vulnerable if nations decide to retaliate with counter tariffs, especially if the nation that imposes the counter tariffs is part of an interconnected supply chain. As I've discussed before, yes, the world needs the United States, but in these interconnected complex sectors, the United States also needs the rest of the world. Let's take the semiconductor industry as an example. Now, the United States in recent years has made an effort to build out domestic semiconductor capacity, especially through the CHIPS Act, but this doesn't change the fact that in the semiconductor supply chain, hundreds of companies are necessary to get from the start to the end, and these companies are found all around the globe. We know that semiconductor tariffs are going to be expected in the next few months, and I can't see how this won't hurt the United States because of how interconnected this sector is. In the world, especially the world of trade, in complex areas of trade, knowledge exchange, open trade, and cross-border research and development can help advance these sectors and benefit everyone around the world. Tariffs in these sectors can stifle innovation and reduce incentives to cooperate. In my opinion, this isn't a good thing, and this is heavily damaging the United States. For me, this negative impact on the United States in interdependent supply chains is the reason why the Liberation Day tariffs in their current form can't return. Trump will continue to use them as a negotiating tool, but in my opinion, that's as far as their utilisation will go. Next time, I will discuss the impact that the tariffs have had on financial markets and the impact that Trump has had in general since he entered office back in January. I'm especially interested in how gold has responded to Trump's second term and what role the dollar plays in the world. I'll discuss that next time. Keep an eye out for that. That will be coming out on Monday. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.